Hello, 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 light listeners. How are you all doing today? Hello to the light listeners. Going to give a few moments for everybody to join us for today's show. Make a couple of adjustments. Make sure we have everything set to public so that everyone could see us and can join us for today's show. As we prepare, I want to do a couple of housekeeping things, if you will. So, first and foremost, I would like to thank you for joining me here at the Light Lupus and I, where I am your host, Salathiel Deloach, and I'd like to guide through a couple of housekeeping items. So, first and foremost, I am not a doctor. I am not a medical professional, nor am I a counselor. What I am, however, is an advocate diagnosed with lupus, sharing insight and my experiences being diagnosed with lupus. And today, I'm being joined by Dr. Cianna Leatherwood, who is a doctor specializing in rheumatology. However, it's also important for me to note that she is not here to provide medical direction or diagnosis. We highly recommend that you contact your personal physician for all of your medical needs. This information discussed on this episode is for informational purposes only. Now let's dive into our conversation. Hello, Dr. Leatherwood. Well, okay. So as she is getting things together, I am going to take a few moments to read her bio. Dr. Cianna Leatherwood, MD, MPH, is a physician with board certification in internal medicine and rheumatology. After graduating from the University of California, Berkeley, with degrees in molecular and cellular biology and public health, she attended medical school at the Keck School of Medicine in the University of South Carolina. She completed internal medicine residency at Los Angeles County USC Hospital and Rheumatology Fellowship in Begum and Women's Hospital. She additionally obtained her master's in public health from Harvard Kahn School of Public Health. Following her training, she practiced rheumatology at Kaiser East Bay, which is located in Oakland and Richmond, California, where she treated patients with lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, vasculitis, and other conditions. She currently works as the Senior Director of Clinical Development at Gilead Science, focusing on the development and treatment for inflammatory and rheumatologic conditions. All right. So we are going to, well, as me and Dr. Leatherwood, we met last year at a conference where she and I were guest speakers for this conference, and we hit it off immediately. After we finished our presentation, we had the opportunity to sit and take the time to get to know each other. And it was a very pleasant conversation that we had. And so I just wanted the opportunity to give her a chance to come onto the episode to tell you a little bit about the work that she does. And also, it seems like she is having some technical difficulties, but I'm going to try to reach out to her to see what's going on. So bear with me. Technology is exactly what technology is, and there is no qualms about that. So let's see. Yeah, I think her service popped out. So while we wait, so do I have any viewers here with me yet? I'll take the time to answer some questions as she comes onto screen. So do we have any viewers that are watching with us? Let me check on my platform to see. All right, here we go. There you go. How are you doing? You're going to have to unmute your mic. Up in your top corner, your mic is muted. And it won't let me unmute you. Give her a chance to get things together. Your mic is still muted.
Can you hear me?
Go. Yes, ma'am. Little technical difficulties never hurt anybody, right? Yeah.
Hello, Salathiel?
Yes, ma'am. I'm here.
No, I can't hear you. I can try connecting from my personal computer if you can hear me right now. I'll try
I can
that.
hear you.
Let's see.
You all just bear with us as we get it fixed. We thought we had it fixed on the background, but it's all good. Everything is going to work out. We're still going to do our interview regardless. This is what it looks like to be live and in color.
If you can hear me, I'm in both my personal computer and my. There you are. I will close this one. Hold on 1 second.
And there we go.
I can hear you.
Just a little time. That's all. That's all.
Oh my goodness.
Nothing a little editing won't fix, right?
Right? Technology.
That's right. That's right. We got to love it. We have to love it. We
I mean,
most
you can't
definitely
live
have to
without
love it.
it. You sometimes
Not
can't.
not in these days.
Not at all.
Not in these days we can't. So
Exactly.
I've already, not sure if you heard, but I've already given your bio. So I would like to just jump straight in.
Let's do
Is
it.
there anything, but starting out on our show that you would love to let the viewers know or about you?
Sure. So I
Yeah.
guess you've already read the background. I guess in terms of who I am as a person. So, I'm a human just like everybody else. I'm a doctor. I'm an African American woman from the United States of America. And I think because I'm these different things, I work in pharma, but I've seen patients. I have a health condition myself, so I think because of all of these different things, I think beyond everything, I'm just me, if that makes any sense. And I kind of just approach things from being who I am and bring different aspects of me to different things that I think about.
How can patients advocate for themselves when, so you work in clinical trials, and so that's kind of the vein that I want to take our conversation. And so one of the first questions that I'd love to ask is how can patients advocate for themselves when they consider the space of participating in a clinical trial?
Absolutely. So I think it starts with knowing kind of what you want. If you want to
Mhm.
participate in a clinical trial, then you're very, you bring that to your appointment. If you don't know if you want to participate in a clinical trial, that's okay. And you bring that to the appointment. But I think, whether you know exactly where you are and your readiness to be in a clinical trial journey, or if you don't know anything at all about clinical trials, or if you know a lot about clinical trials and you've participated in them before, and you're very comfortable with it. I think as long as you are comfortable with wherever you are and bring that energy and curiosity to your experiences where you have opportunities to participate in them, that's the best place to start. Because if you start having a conversation about clinical trials with your provider and they think that you have tons and tons and tons of knowledge about clinical trials, they may not necessarily explain the process to you in a way that really lets you know how it's going to be. On the flip side, if you have a tremendous amount of experience participating in clinical trials and they explain their one experience to you and it doesn't jive with your prior experiences, you may start to think, maybe this isn't the trial for me.
How would you explain a clinical trial to an individual? This is their first time in their office, and you're running a clinical trial. Or you're aware of a clinical trial. How would you go about introducing, a patient to clinical trials?
So ideally, that introduction process to clinical trials wouldn't actually occur at the time that someone needs to start considering a clinical trial.
Hmm.
In an
Okay.
ideal world, a clinical trial would be introduced at the very beginning of an interaction when you establish care with a provider in the context of, you have X condition, these are treatments available for X condition. Sometimes, if these treatments don't seem to be working very well, we can consider clinical trials further down the line. But this is all part of the treatment pathway. Rather than what usually ends up happening is that someone goes to see the doctor, they're diagnosed with a certain condition, they try several different treatments that don't work. And at the end of this path of trying several different treatments that don't work, then they're suddenly introduced to the idea of a clinical trial. And then they're suddenly thrust in this space of having to very quickly think about, what do they think about clinical trials? Do they have clinical trials? And it sort of digest all of this information very quickly when they aren't feeling great. Ideally,
Hmm.
that process would start in the very beginning of their healthcare journey, and it would be established as a path in their treatment journey. But if in a position to introduce the overall concept of a clinical trial, what is it? I would tell someone that a clinical trial is an opportunity to participate in a study with a new treatment, which means that it's a treatment that there's a lot of evidence that suggests that it might work, but it may not actually work. We don't know. And the purpose of the clinical trial is to evaluate whether or not this new treatment is something that could be an option for patients with whatever condition that it's being designated to treat. Now, the thing that one does need to be upfront with the clinical trial is that A, what is the evidence that the treatment may actually work?
Okay.
Sometimes the
Okay.
evidence is based off of animal models and preclinical things, meaning that it hasn't been tried in a human with your particular condition yet. It doesn't mean that it hasn't been tried in any humans, just
Right.
maybe not in a human with your particular condition. Versus if it's a late stage clinical trial, it could very well be something that's been tried in humans with your particular clinical condition for several different stages. And there's a lot of evidence that it really, really works pretty well, but there isn't enough evidence to get it to approval by the FDA. And that's the role of the clinical trial. The
What
other
are
thing
some? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Another thing that I think is important to hit is that based off of the design of the clinical trial, if it's an open label trial, that means that everybody's going to get the treatment. But if it's a
Okay.
randomized clinical trial, it's important to realize that a person can be randomized to receive the trial or to receive the treatment or to not receive the treatment. And that's to better understand amongst people who get it versus people who don't. Do the people who get the treatment do better? But just because someone may be randomized to the arm that does not receive the treatment doesn't mean that they won't receive any therapy. It just means that they may continue to receive the same therapy with a placebo version of the tested treatment, or they may be randomized to receive the tested treatment.
So I personally have never participated in a clinical trial, but I often hear the terminology. They need to have an informed consent. So can you explain the process of a informed consent and why it's critical for patients to actually consider participating in clinical trials?
Absolutely. So, first off, what exactly is an informed consent, right? So, just as the
Yeah.
words suggest, it's informed. So, somebody is letting you know, and consent, somebody is getting your permission to have you participate in the clinical trial. But it's more than just, letting someone know, because
Hmm.
technically, an informed consent is a document that a participant in a clinical trial needs to sign that says, they've told me about the trial. They've told me how many study visits I need to come back for. They've told me what they're going to do in terms of physical exam and blood samples that they're going to be taking and maybe a biopsy or some imaging. They've explained all of that to me. They've answered all of my questions. And being informed about this study, I consent to participate.
Okay.
Now,
Okay.
of course, there's more than just reading a document, right? Because if you look at the
Right.
actual
Right.
papers, the informed consent comes on. Sometimes the words using these things, I mean, you need like a PhD
Right.
in to understand what exactly it all
Yeah.
says. And so part of the informed consent process goes way beyond just someone handing you a document and you signing it and saying, sure, sign me up. It really has to do with, have you had an opportunity to be explained to about what the study is? Do you have any remaining questions? And are you fully comfortable? If you are not fully comfortable with moving forward with a clinical trial, you are absolutely under no obligation to agree to participate in the clinical trial. You are under no obligation to sign that informed consent. If the person that explained the trial to you got a funny feeling from, or something isn't matching up with what you thought the study was going to be versus
Right.
what you're hearing, or if somebody said something to you that you didn't fully understand and you didn't feel comfortable asking, but you walked away not really understanding what it was, you are
Hmm.
absolutely under no obligation to sign that informed consent. I don't even care if you're at the last page and the person's staring at you, waiting for you to sign right then and there. If you're not ready to sign, you don't have to sign. And not only do you not have to sign, you not signing should not have any impact on the care that you receive. You don't have to worry that, oh, if I don't
Right.
sign this informed consent, I'm not going to be able to get a clinic appointment. If I don't sign this informed consent, if something happens to me, no one's going to help me. That's not the case at all. The purpose of the informed consent is a process for you to understand what study you're signing up for.
You mentioned that the consent has a lot of words that you need a PhD to understand. So, is there someone that's available to help someone that might be interested, but like you said, the jargon that's within the writing, they can't quite understand it? So, is there someone to assist the individual who's considering participating? Is there something or someone there available to assist them with filling out that documentation? And what does that look like? Because
Yeah,
I think of the space of not potentially having someone, like you said, force you into it.
exactly. Can you see me okay? Is my screen frozen?
It froze.
Uh-oh. It said my computer was unplugged. Um,
So, to everyone that is watching, I am currently completing an interview with Dr. Cianna Leatherwood. She is a rheumatologist, but in addition to being a rheumatologist, she also conducts clinical trials. And so, me personally, I've never participated in a clinical trial as it relates to for medications and things of that nature. But I have participated in a few different types of trials. And so as we progress through our interview, I'm going to make sure that I ask her some questions about the different types of clinical trials that exist. Um, and just I just want to make sure that I use this platform to help educate those of you who are like me, who have never participated in a clinical trial that contains medication and things of that nature, to try to get us some information about what that looks like before, because I'm a firm believer in gaining knowledge about the things that do exist. I don't necessarily have to participate in a clinical trial that contains medication, but just to have the information is powerful. I personally believe. And, the ability to be able to bring resources in to educate the people that live around me. We have urban and rural communities that don't typically have access to clinical trials or aren't aware. I'm not going to say we don't have access to them because they're out on the internet. So we do have access to them, but we just aren't aware of them as someone living in a different, city or county may be exposed to it. And so I'm trying to do my best as an advocate of lupus to bring those resources to our city, to a platform such as, us being on Facebook and Instagram, and we're also on YouTube. Shameless plug, please. If you're watching this video and you are watching us from YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to my channel, because I'm going to be doing interviews just as this. I'm going to be making sure that those interviews are presented live in real time for most situations, because we have people who want to ask questions. We're mostly right now on Facebook, so if you're not on Facebook and you want to ask a question, tap over onto Facebook. Come on over to Facebook and ask a question. We are more than welcome to. You are more than welcome to join us on stage and to ask questions.
Can you
Can
hear
you
me?
hear me? Yes, ma'am.
This my computer, two computers now have
It's
just
okay.
not been vibing with me.
It's okay. This is reality.
Man, oh man. Okay. So where were we? So sorry about that.
No, no, no. You're perfectly fine. You were getting ready to tell us about that space of a patient needing assistance with filling out the informed consent.
Exactly. So, and you would ask specifically, is there someone that can help you understanding what this language is in the informed consent? And is there a designated person for that? So there's a couple of different answers to that. The first is the staff at the clinic should be able to help translate that for you
Okay.
if it's an issue. So I guess even if we take a step back, the informed consent itself should actually be written ideally in language that's very easy to understand.
Okay.
These days, it doesn't happen all the time, but there is a push to ensure that the informed consents, when they're being drafted, that at least there's a focus on trying to think about making sure that the language is understandable to at least an eighth
Okay.
grade reading education. If it's not, then the staff at the clinic that you're participating in the clinical trial at should be able to very clearly explain to you what exactly is in the document. I mean, even if the document is written clearly, I mean, these documents can be, 8, 10, 12 pages long. And the idea that someone is going
Yeah.
to really be able to read every single word with such detail, it doesn't always happen. So the study staff should be able to explain it to you. If that's not the case, I would consider maybe thinking about a different place to participate in the clinical trial. But B, we don't always have options, right? So B would
Right.
be for certain trials, there can be a buddy program. So I know,
Okay.
and being trial agnostic right now, I won't say the specific study, but I do know that there are a couple of different studies that have buddy programs. And the buddy programs are designed to sort of pair you up with someone who's participated in a clinical trial before, maybe not that specific one, but they're familiar with that specific trial, and they can help
Mhm.
explain to you some of the language if there's any confusion. And then the other thing is, a clinical trial process doesn't have to be an isolating experience. You don't have to go to these appointments all
Okay.
by yourself. If you have a family member or a friend who's very invested in your health that you're comfortable going with you to these appointments, you are absolutely always welcome to have these other individuals join you.
Oh, okay. And that's interesting and important news. I like to tell patients that space of if you're going into an appointment, making sure you're writing things down, but the opposite space of that, if you're going into a situation, I personally would think going in to learn about a clinical trial or starting a clinical trial might have a space of causing someone anxiety because it's their first time, and so having someone else in that room with them to kind of help keep them calm, or even to take notes that, when you're talking to a doctor, you're engaged with that doctor. So having that person in the room with you to take down some notes or to be able to present questions that you in real time aren't actually thinking about. So I think that was a very great note to add, as it relates to participating in clinical trials and knowing that you can have someone with you. Now, I definitely don't believe in shying away from the uncomfortable conversations. So tell us a little bit about the stigmas or the negative things that come along, that a lot of people think of. I know, as being in that space of research, you've heard quite a few stories. So tell us a little bit about that space of some of the stigmas that are surrounding clinical trials.
Absolutely. I think the biggest one is, I mean, even something that kind of every now and then pops into my mind. I'm not trying to be somebody's guinea pig. We all think about
Right.
the prior experiences that have been, made known, Tuskegee experiences on people that are in prisons, you know, experiments from an OB-GYN perspective on slave women, just the history just goes back and back and back. And that's why in the beginning, when you asked, who am I? My first thought was, well, I'm, a human, but I'm an African American woman working
Okay.
in healthcare in America. And,
Right.
I carry that with me because my general outlook on life is you're not about to touch me with your guinea pig medicine.
Right.
Now, at the
Right.
same time, I will say, because, the things that have happened, Tuskegee, opiate history, all of those things are very real. And
Hmm.
because of the things that have happened, clinical trials these days is an incredibly regulated space. What do I mean by
Okay.
that? It means that there are a lot of rules that have to be followed for a clinical trial to even be opened. And then when the clinical trial is opened, to be able to continue running the clinical trial, there's a lot of rules that have to be followed, as there should be. We're talking about people and their health.
Right.
Um, and so because of that, a lot of the things that have occurred in the past in terms of, inappropriate activities towards patient populations that don't necessarily have access to advocate for themselves are really regulated by the federal government, by the local government, and by the institutions that allow clinical trials to occur in the first place. And by institutions, I mean the clinic that signs up to participate in a clinical trial has to have the trial run by an institutional review board. And an institutional review board is an overarching regulatory body that reviews the clinical trial and either says, yes, you're allowed to participate, or 100% of the time they say, well, think about it, but before you can participate, before you can do this clinical trial here, you need to tell us why you want to do this, why you want to do that. You have to change that. That's not going to work for our patients, so it's going to be, you
Right.
have to change it to this, da 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 da. And so for that reason, I just want to stress that, the things that have happened in the past are very real. And as a
Mhm.
result, there's been a lot of change, particularly in the amount of rules and the regulations that are applied to even allow a clinical trial to open in the first place.
How would you address those, some of the common fears or misconceptions that the patients may have surrounding clinical trials? Like, what are some, I guess, comfort tactics or education things that you might do?
I think the first thing is just to find out what they are, just to have an open and
Okay.
honest conversation about what exactly is it. Are you worried about the guinea pig nature? I mean, quite frankly, sometimes, we think that there's reticence about participating in a clinical trial because there's a fundamental, aversion to a clinical trial, when in reality, they're not opposed to a
Hmm.
clinical trial. They just have to go to work, or they have kids that need to be cared for. So if it's a deep seated, fundamentally, I don't rock with clinical trials because I don't want to be a guinea pig or da 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 da, then we can talk about that. From my experience, that
Right.
isn't always the case. And in reality, there's much more logistical things, which, if that is the case, a lot of times in clinical trials, there can be, if you have childcare issues, here's an option for childcare. Here's a reimbursement if you need to get a babysitter. If you need time off of work, here's a reimbursement for the
Yeah.
amount of time that you took off of work. If you don't have a car and you can't get to the appointment, here's a Lyft app and we'll pay for your transportation. If it's all of the
Hmm.
above, then here's reimbursement for all of the above. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it just kind of
Right.
depends on what the issue is.
And I think that was more so this direction I wanted you to go into because again, I've never personally, from a medical perspective, medication and things of that nature, I've never participated in a clinical trial. But being in some of the rooms that I have had the opportunity to be in the rooms, and when you have this chance to listen to patients that have had the opportunity to participate, and those type of conversations come up, well, they don't have the childcare, or they don't have the funds. Sometimes they talk about the amount of money that they have been given to participate in the trial. And while it's not about the money for them to participate, the money is still
The
a
money's
factor.
the math isn't mathing. Exactly.
Exactly, exactly. They still have to find childcare. They still have to get their medication. They still have to get to and from those appointments. Like someone that might live where I am, the typical place that's going to do clinical trials that I'm aware of, and not saying that that is all, but that I am aware of, is going to be either Atlanta or one of the Carolinas. And
Mhm.
either way, they're 4 hours away from me. So then
It's
you
going to
have
be
to
some
add into
travel.
that space. Yeah, you got to add
Mhm.
into that space to travel. And then, in addition to adding in the travel, what about the effects that the travel has had on the person's body? So instead of me coming down the day that I'm supposed to be participating, I need to come down the day before. And so now I have
Exactly.
to take off of work, and these things just kind of compile against each other. And while that patient may have this strong desire to participate in those clinical trials, like, these are still real things, that they have to conquer or endure to participate. And so that's a space. Has there been, and this is literally just off the cuff, a thought that just popped into my head, are there clinical trials that don't require a patient necessarily to travel outside, like that space of, I'm participating in a clinical trial, but I can go to my local doctor to do all of the things and they send it off? Like, can you tell me a little bit about what that space looks like?
Exactly. So, what you're kind of describing is this entity called a decentralized clinical trial. And so, what does that mean? So, usually, clinical trials, like you mentioned, the closest place to you to do a clinical trial is potentially in Atlanta, if you're at Emory University or something like that, going to one of the big universities in a big city, and recognizing the difficulty that, even quite frankly, if someone is in the same city, it can still be quite tricky to get to the clinic as frequently as is sometimes required for a clinical trial. Let alone, like you mentioned, if there's a 4-hour drive, 8 hours round trip,
Hmm.
now we're talking a couple of days of travel. It's for some very much off the table.
Right.
So there is a push towards the movement of decentralized clinical trials. And the idea of that is for certain visits, you need to go to the site where the clinical trial is. But for certain
Okay.
visits, you don't necessarily need to be at the physical site. Maybe it's just labs that can be done at a local lab. Maybe it's a telephone visit that can occur instead of an in-person visit. And that has actually occurred in several different clinical trials. So there's
Okay.
an ongoing push to identify which are the critical visits and which are the visits that individuals can have labs done in a local fashion, and have a telephone visit. Now, to your point, there are certain visits that really one can't really get away from. The key
Okay.
visits that evaluate whether or not the treatment is working, those have to be done at the site where the clinical trial is being administered. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it should be a burden on a participant. And so
Hmm.
the better thing would be to be able to have a better distribution of clinical trial sites. And so for the trials that we work on, for example, we're constantly trying to identify where are the gaps in the locations where we have the clinical trials, recognizing that the gaps definitely still remain, no matter how hard you work to try and have sites that don't require anyone to have to drive 4 hours to a clinical trial. Sometimes, unfortunately, based off of just where sites are located, some places really have no sites. So, to try
Right.
and get an opportunity for people who live in areas that really have no sites, there's this introduction, like you mentioned, of options for local labs being done at your local
Hmm.
location, telephone visits when appropriate, but there's still definitely a gap in terms of what is available for folks like you who live 4 hours away from your nearest clinical trial site.
Right. And so I hear this word, the different phases of clinical trials. So can you educate us on what are maybe the different phases of a clinical trial? And I guess starting from that space of recruitment.
So you mean in terms of like phase one, phase two, phase three, phase four clinical
Hmm.
trials?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we kind of talked
Yeah.
about it a little bit, but the different phases of clinical trials have to do with how much human experience is there in a particular treatment in that
Okay.
particular condition. So technically, it starts out all the way at phase one clinical trial. And so a phase one clinical trial is, you know, yesterday this treatment was in the lab and tested in monkeys and tested in rats, but we've never put it in a human being before. And a phase
Okay.
one clinical trial, for the most part, is done in healthy volunteers, unless it's a condition like cancer, in which case, because cancer treatments can be very, very strong, sometimes they can be
Hmm.
too strong to try in healthy volunteers. And so the phase one study is only allowed to kick off if the animal studies, the monkey studies, the rat studies, rabbit studies, things like that, if they have shown a clean profile. If they've shown a clean
Okay.
profile and it's now thought, okay, we can take this into human trials, the first phase is a phase one trial. You have some healthy volunteers. They're usually put in a phase one clinical trial center where they're watched all day, every day for a few days after receiving the treatment to make sure that everything is okay.
And I'm going
And
to pause you for a second. When you
sure,
say in a center, you mean like at a clinic?
at a clinic, but where they physically go for phase one clinical trials, they can physically go and check into the clinic like they're checking into a
Okay.
hotel, and they can
Okay.
stay there for, 3, 5, 10, 14 days, however many days the
Okay.
protocol
Thank you.
specifies. And
Perfect.
that's to make sure, it's the very first time that it's being given in humans. We just really want to make sure that we're keeping eyes on how
Yes.
this is doing in people and healthy people before we even enter it into people who have health conditions.
Right. I have a lot
And
of followers who don't have that background, so I want to make sure they understand exactly what we're talking about.
I appreciate that note. And
Yes,
anytime
ma'am.
there's a question to clarify, happy to take it. So
Perfect.
phase one, healthy volunteers, folks physically go to it's called a clinical trial unit, which is a fancy way of
Okay.
saying they stay at the clinic.
Okay.
So then let's say phase one goes great. You know, everybody does really, really well. They all leave the clinic feeling fine. Their labs look good. Then the next step is a phase 2 study. And the phase 2 study is usually, like I said, with the exception of oncology trials, usually phase 2 studies is the first time that the treatment is tried in people with a particular condition, whether it's lupus,
Okay.
whether it's high blood pressure, whether it's athlete's foot, whether it's alopecia, whatever it is, it usually starts being tried in people in that phase 2 study. And that's when certain questions arise, like which doses do we think is going to be the best in a particular condition? Which regimens do we think are going to be the best? This can be informed by the phase 1 data and by the
Mm-hmm.
preclinical data, all of that data that came from the rats and the animals and the monkeys. But it doesn't necessarily get refined until you start trying it in people. And so
Gotcha.
phase 2 studies in a condition tend to be on the smaller side. So where a phase 3 study may be, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of participants, the phase 2 study can be a few hundred participants, sometimes, you know, 50 to maybe a couple hundred participants. And so the phase 2 study occurs, people do really, really well, and it becomes clear, you know what, we tried 3 different doses in the phase 2 study. From the phase 2 study, it looks like the best dose is actually going to be either this one or that one. So we're
Okay.
now going to move to a phase 3 study to prove that what we saw in the smaller phase 2 study actually holds up when we put it in a lot of different
Gotcha.
people. Because
Okay.
sometimes, just from a numbers perspective alone, you know, you can have 50 people in a study, and just the way that it was distributed, it looks like it works. But
Yeah.
sometimes when you take it to a much bigger setting, it may not necessarily work. And so the phase 3 study is a bigger study to prove that it works.
Gotcha. That is awesome. Awesome news, because not realizing that that too is going to always be a smaller group of people. And like you
Yes,
said, you have smaller numbers and you have all of these people that are doing well. So it appears that it works, but it's in the three. It's in the phase 3 that we find out whether this is really something that that we should, that we could, not even should, that we could potentially push. And we're going to do all the research here or apply pressure in that space because we've proven it now. So
that's exactly.
that's awesome news to know and to be able to share. Now, types of clinical trials. Right now we're talking more medication. So educate us on what types of clinical trials there are, because a lot of times people, I'll say even myself, a lot of times prior to the work that I'm doing now, I always thought that clinical trials was just taking medication or taking a placebo. And that was the only type there was. So I would love that opportunity for you to explain to us what types of clinical trials exist.
Absolutely. So even if we take a step back and remove the clinical trial piece from it and just talk about types of trials in general, right? So
Okay.
you can have what are called observational trials where, you know, let's say you go to your rheumatologist and your rheumatologist works at, you know, a university, and they have a group of patients that they study over time to see how they do. There's
Hmm.
no intervention or change in the medications they get. It just says, when you come to your clinic visits, do you agree to be part of our trial to see how you do over time? So that's a type of trial. You know, trials don't necessarily have to give you anything. It can just
Hmm.
be, let's follow you over time and see how you do. And what they use that information for is to see over time, are there certain risk factors that certain people have that can either predict that they're going to do really,
Okay.
really well or do worse. So that's a type of observational trial. When we talk about clinical trials, now a clinical trial very specifically tends to do with some sort of intervention. And by intervention,
Okay.
what do I mean? I work in a pharmaceutical company, so our intervention is a treatment, whether it's a pill, whether it's an injection, whether it's a cream, it's some sort of drug, basically.
Right.
But you can have interventions that have to do with devices. So if you wear a study where they're trying to see if there's, you know, those little biometric rings, like the rings that you can put on
Hmm.
that detect your heart rate, you can have an intervention that tests one of those. You can have an intervention that tests physical therapy devices, whether one particular knee sleeve is better than the
Okay.
other. So there are all kinds of different interventions. Now, when we talk about clinical trials that test interventions, namely drugs, that you could have them sort of look different kinds of ways. So they can be the sort of standard, which is a randomized, meaning that, you know, there's a 50-50 chance that you're either going to get a drug or a placebo, or depending on how the numbers work out, it may actually be a 75% chance that you're going to get a drug versus a 25% chance that you're going to get a placebo. It's just a matter of what dose of the drug. Or sometimes it's a 60% chance of getting the drug and a 40% chance of getting placebo. So that's what the randomized piece is, when there's a chance that you might get drug or a chance that you might get placebo. And within that, even when we say placebo, placebo doesn't necessarily mean straight water pill. Placebo could actually mean
Okay.
standard of care. And so sometimes you'll see placebo, but if you read closely or if they explain it to you appropriately, it's not true just a water pill. Like either you're going to get this miraculous drug or you're just going to be out on a limb. It's,
Yeah.
either you're going to get the new treatment that they're testing, or you're going to get the standard of care, which is maybe what you're already taking, or maybe a different, what you're already taking plus something else.
Gotcha.
The other word that you might see is blinded versus unblinded. So a blinded study means you're going to get a treatment, but no one's going to actually know what you got, because sometimes there can be what's called a placebo effect or a treatment effect, meaning
Yeah.
that if I'm in a clinical trial and I know I'm getting a new treatment, I might just feel better because I'm like, oh, I'm on this new treatment. And so suddenly
Yeah.
my
The
food
thought of
score
it.
has gotten better because, oh, I'm on a treatment, so I'm fine. Like, I'm doing good. I'm in this
Yeah.
trial. That in sometimes can alter the numbers. It's called a placebo effect.
Hmm.
And so when it's blinded, it just means that nobody actually knows if you're getting the treatment or if you're getting the placebo or the standard of care. Versus unblinded, which does happen. Everybody kind of knows what treatment you're getting. And sometimes if there's a safety concern, for example, in some of the cancer treatments, some of those with some of the side effects, you kind of have to know if somebody's getting a particular treatment. With some of the
Yeah.
CAR T, for example, you kind of have to know if somebody's getting CAR T, because there's some pretty big implications to cell therapy, to big treatments like that.
Right.
But generally, the studies are blinded.
You mentioned CAR T, and I want to
Mm-hmm.
make sure the viewers know. So, do you mind, sharing some information? Tell us what a CAR T is.
So a CAR T treatment is basically taking advantage of the immune system. And so the idea is that with certain diseases like lupus or other autoimmune diseases, it's mediated because you have B cells in your body, and B cells are responsible for making antibodies. The same thing, same reason you get a vaccination against COVID, or reason you get a vaccination against the flu, is because your B cells are going to see that vaccine and they're going to make these antibodies. So when you get a real flu or a real COVID, no big deal. You have antibodies that can go attack it, clear it out your system. We're good. But every now and then, in people who have autoimmune conditions, those B cells, instead of making antibodies to bad things like the flu or COVID, they can
Hmm.
accidentally make antibodies to good things like your body. And so in lupus, it can be antibodies to a double-stranded DNA, or to the EANA, for example, is a particular type of
Yeah.
antibody. In rheumatoid arthritis, the quintessential antibody is an anti-CCP antibody. There's just certain diseases that, particularly autoimmune diseases, that fundamentally are as a result of your B cells kind of going awry and making
Yeah.
antibodies to you. And so what CAR T is a specific T cell that's taken from your body, sent to a lab, engineered to express a specific cell surface marker so that it can go and attack the person's B cells and get rid of them transiently, sort of cleaning them and wiping a new slate,
Wow.
but not all of your very beginner B cells. So it kind of erases the bad B cells so that your very stem cell baby B cells can actually grow and produce new, very good B cells. Because the fundamental
Wow.
problem with the B cells isn't inherent to the very stem cell B cell. It's something that happens over time. And so if you clear your body of these what are called pathogenic, basically bad B cells, and you give
Mm-hmm.
your bone marrow an opportunity to grow new clean B cells, then it can help get rid of, for many patients who have fundamental issues with B cells as their problem, it can help get rid of the particular condition. And so what some of the data has shown, and it's very, very early days from, only a few
Right.
sites, very early days, but in some patients from, a small number of patients, they've shown quite remarkable responses. Now, that being said, CAR T in and of itself is tricky because, as you can imagine, the process of giving CAR T involves getting rid of the majority of your B cells. And you need B
Mm-hmm.
cells for a reason. The body didn't
Right.
make B cells because you don't need them. So
Absolutely.
there So the process of even jump starting the CAR T, the medication that's used to do that, it's called quote unquote lymphodepletion.
Mm-hmm.
That involves giving a set of very strong medications, one of which is cyclophosphamide, which can be used in lupus treatment. But that
Mm-hmm.
involves lowering your counts very, very low. So there can be a pretty significant risk of an infection, particularly in that early treatment phase. Um,
Right.
as you get rid of the B cells using the T cells, there are certain spikes in blood chemicals called cytokines, and
Mm-hmm.
cytokines can cause inflammation. And that type of inflammation can cause issues in different parts of the body. So you can get a fever, you can get confused. And there are treatments for what's called cytokine release syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
But in the immediate phase, that generally is what the majority of the concern is. And so as a result, patients need to be hospitalized when they receive this treatment for the first few days to make sure that they're going to
Yeah.
do okay.
Yeah, and that was actually one of my questions. Because of the I get, for lack of better wording, because of the danger, I was going to ask if they needed to be placed in the hospitals for to make sure that they are observed for a certain amount of time. So thank you. And we've been seeing the CAR T, so I'm very happy that you mentioned it, because we randomly see these things pop up on the television, on a commercial or something of that nature, and we go to Dr. Google, and Dr. Google has this massive, definition of what it is, but to have someone be able to break it down to a space where we can actually comprehend it and, like we say, make it make sense.
Yeah,
And
I
so
hear
that's
you.
very, very helpful.
CAR T is, I think it's fascinating. And
Yeah.
I think over time, the safety issues are definitely concerning. I think over time, those
Mm-hmm.
safety issues are probably going to be figured out and they'll be made safer and safer and safer. But for now, because of those safety issues, namely the infectious issues, the cytokine release syndrome
Mm-hmm.
issue, the fact that people have to be in the hospital to receive it in the first place, because
Yeah.
people don't just go to the hospital because they're bored. If you got to go to the hospital for something, there's a
It's
reason for
true, right?
it.
It's the
um,
last result. Last result.
it's a last result. So because of these safety issues, right now the trials are in people who have very, very, very relatively severe
Mm-hmm.
manifestations, whether it's lupus or myositis or whatever condition. But over time, once those safety issues are further worked out, I think it may potentially be broadened in terms of its availability. But we'll just have to
And the
see
body is so
how it works.
amazing.
Girl,
The
the
body is
body is
just
just
so amazing. Yeah.
amazing. The body
And like you
is
said,
crazy.
the space of our body creating these things, and the science being, them finding it, and learning the science that goes into it, but just the fact that the body can create these things to heal itself. We just have to know the tools, for lack of better wording, the tricks, to assist them on the journey. But the body can heal itself, if we do our part, if you will. Um, what are some things that researchers do to ensure the safety of participants when it
So
comes to clinical trials?
there's a ton of things that we do, which is probably why clinical trials can be so cumbersome to participate in. So all of
Mm-hmm.
the lab work, all of the visits, everything that's done effectively is to ensure that people are going to be okay. Or if there's
Yeah.
something that's happening, to understand, why is it happening? Is it something that would happen in everybody? Or is it something that if an individual doesn't take certain medication that may impact the liver, this won't happen. So
Yeah.
it starts with the sites that are approached to participate, at least working at a sponsor at a pharmaceutical company. It starts with knowing what sites are participating in the clinical trials.
Okay.
How
Okay.
reliable are the individuals that are going to be recruiting? I mean, of course, one assumes that everybody is going to be reliable, but we really want to make sure that
Yeah.
the information is being shared. I don't want to be worried that somebody was approached about a study and forced to sign an informed consent and they didn't actually know
Right.
anything
Right.
about the trial. And, so going to places that are going to be reliable is the first step. The second is all of those labs have safety labs. All of those clinic
Okay.
visits are made for the express intent of understanding adverse events. And adverse events is just a fancy way of saying, did something bad happen while you were on the treatment? And if it did, what was
Okay.
it? And if whatever it was did happen, do we think it's because you're on the treatment, or do we think it's because you went skiing? And sometimes if you go skiing, you might break a leg. Or is it because you're on the treatment, you went skiing, you fell and you broke a leg, but the treatment made your bones weaker, so you shouldn't have broke the leg? You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
all of that information, all of those questions that are asked during the visits, it's all revolving around ensuring that the treatment is going to be safe. And
Gotcha.
quite frankly, for a medication to be approved by the FDA, yes, they care if it works, but their primary mandate is the treatment safe. So if the treatment works, like for CAR T, for example, if CAR T gets rid of lupus for everybody, but 30% of people who receive it have something horrible happen, like
Mm-hmm.
horrible,
Yeah.
it's going to be no, because the
Yeah.
primary is it safe enough to give? So
Right.
the key is safety.
So how do researchers ensure like diversity and inclusion when it comes to clinical trials?
Well, that's the next question. So define and sure, right? Clearly across the board, diversity, inclusion,
Yeah.
and clinical trial participation is problematic. If you look at the
Yeah.
numbers, I think even specifically for lupus, it's what, like, lupus disproportionately impacts, 40, 50%
African
of
American.
women,
Yeah.
but the participants,
Yeah.
for that reason, you would think that you would have that many participants in the clinical trials, but it's, single digits. Maybe in a certain trial you might find double digits, but it's generally single digits of
All right.
participants. And that has to do with several different things, right? Like, it
Yeah.
has to do with where do folks live and where are clinical trial sites being opened up.
Yeah.
How easy is it to participate in clinical trials? When you inquire about a clinical trial, what is your relationship with your provider? And do you trust them, or do you get a
Right.
funny feeling
Right.
from them? It's much deeper than, let's just go advertise this trial to,
Exactly.
this place. And so because of the fact that it's much deeper, there's kind of things being done with relative success, define success, I suppose, but there's
Yes.
things
Yes.
being
Yes.
across the board. So there's a push to try and identify clinical trial sites in quote unquote diverse, we always know what diverse
Right.
means. There's a
Right.
push to
Right.
try and
Right.
identify
Right.
clinical trial sites in a more
Yeah.
diverse set of locations. And that includes not just the US, but also globally. There are certain parts of the
Exactly.
world that don't have clinical trial representation. Beyond that, like I mentioned before, there's a push to ensure that the language in the informed consent is understandable, at least an
Right.
eighth grade reading level. There's a push to ensure that for individuals who need it, if there's a child care barrier or a job barrier or travel barrier, that there's reimbursement for those things. But even beyond the actual things that are occurring in the specific clinical trial, there are several different, companies that are funding pipelines for, investigator training, such that at the physician training level, there are investigators of color that are funded to be able to learn how to be an investigator for clinical trials, so that they're, if a patient comes in and prefers a certain type of provider, whether it's a woman or a particular ethnicity, there's just more opportunities for them to find the provider that they prefer that can help shuttle them into a clinical trial. So I think
Absolutely.
there's a lot of stuff being done. Um, I think someone called it kitchen sink once, just doing
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
everything and
Throw
hoping
the
for the
kitchen sink.
best.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
some of it seems to work, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. 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 And one final question. What advice would you give a patient who is considering participating in clinical trials for the very first time?
So the first set of advice that I would give is, you know, ask your questions. Any question
Mhm.
that you have about a clinical trial, do not hesitate to ask your provider. Your provider should be whether it's the doctor, the nurse, whoever is bringing the clinical trial to you as an option, they should be able to answer any and all questions about the trial that you may have. And if there is a question that they can't answer, they can always ask the sponsor. We get emails from providers all the time about
Mhm.
different parts of the clinical trial. I would also say, if you can find a clinical trial buddy or someone that you can talk to that's participated in one before, there's no experience like experience, so
Right.
the the best people that can help inform you are people that have participated in it before. Now, if somebody had
That's true.
a bad experience with a clinical trial, then help try to understand what it was and see if this particular clinical trial has things that may result in a different outcome. If someone had a
That's
great
true.
experience in a clinical trial, try to understand what made it a great experience. Was it the provider that they worked with? Was it the nurse that was working with them? Was it the way that the trial allowed, for more visits, and they felt that they had more access to the clinic? Just try and understand what the underlying either strengths of their experience were or limitations of their experience were, to see if it would be applicable
Okay.
to you. And then I
Awesome.
think the other thing is, to the extent that you can, recognizing that Dr. Google is, a rabbit hole, to the extent that
Right.
you can.
Endless.
Oh gosh, I mean, I went down Dr. Google rabbit hole the other day. What was it? Oh, on Chat GPT, and I thought I was
Oh,
an expert now, and I'm not at all.
I don't think
Anyway,
any of us are.
at all. But the way I was reacting after I wrote my little Wikipedia page, you would have thought I had a PhD. I don't know. But to the extent that you can, just trying to educate yourself on what
Yeah.
the words are,
Hmm.
randomized, placebo, standard of care, just so that it doesn't feel so foreign when you go into the experience. If they start talking in these words, that you understand the language and how it applies to the trial that you're particularly considering, because it's really important that you really fully understand what the trial is trying to do and how they're trying to do it.
Right. 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 Well, Dr. Leatherwood, I would like to thank you for joining me here this evening on The Light Lupus and I. You have definitely helped us light the way for those that may have some type of interest or wanting to know some more information about clinical trials or just trials, period, to give them a different view in a space that's not necessarily so scary, just to be able to hear a doctor communicate her profession. And so I thank you for your time. And it has been a true blessing. To those of you that are watching the replay, we thank you for your time. We thank you for joining us here today on The Light Lupus and I, where I am your host, Salathiel Deloach.